in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Heading into this year, analysts were unusually divided over the oil market's prospects. Prices had increased sharply last year after the COVID-related collapse the year before. Looking at 2022, many analysts thought that OPEC's, the planned production increases from the so-called OPEC Plus group, which included not only the traditional OPEC members, but also 10 non-OPEC members, including Russia, they thought that the planned production increases from that group, plus momentum from U.S. shale production, would finally catch up with demand. But the bulls doubted whether those production increases would materialize and whether they would be able to keep up with demand. Prices were already flirting with $100 a barrel, and then Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. Why does this matter for the oil market? Well, we're talking about the world's, depending on the day that you measure it, either the biggest or the second biggest exporter of oil in the world. Indeed, Russia is a large exporter of both crude oil and refined products. Moreover, Russia is also the biggest exporter of natural gas. If you count all forms of fossil energy, Russia is the world's biggest fossil energy exporter and a large exporter of other commodities, including metals and grains. Following the invasion, we saw the institution of very strong economic sanctions from the U.S., Europe, and other allied countries, targeting Russia's banks, including the central bank and its hard currency reserves, as well as key individuals in government and industry. But, importantly, largely not targeting the energy sector. Yes, we did see some bans on purchasing Russian oil here in the United States, in the UK, and in Canada, but nothing systematic, no JCPOA Iran-style sanctions on overall sales of oil or natural gas from Russia. So far, Presidents Biden and Putin, as well as Russian leaders, have been clear that they do not want to target Russian energy exports. However, this is a very fluid situation. Previously, leaders had been very clear that they did not intend to include the SWIFT transaction system in sanctions, and yet the course of events have led us to that already. So prepare to be surprised, right? We've already seen on the policy front reactions by consuming countries, a coordinated release of strategic stocks from members of the International Energy Agency, and also the International Energy Agency promulgated to its members and oil consumers around the world a 10-point plan for how to reduce oil use quickly. All of this is simply a recognition of the critical importance that oil plays to modern economic life. It is by far still the world's largest single source of energy. But even without official sanctions on the oil and gas sector, companies, as always, are out in front. We briefly saw reports a few weeks ago that as much as 3 million barrels a day of Russian oil was unable to find buyers. Although subsequent reports say that most of those cargoes are now finding new buyers, albeit at sharp discounts of as much as $30 a barrel. So where do we go from here? What are prospects for global oil supply and demand, both crude oil and refined products, by the way? What can the oil market and its players do to cope with a potential disruption of Russian crude oil and refined product exports, or a massive adjustment of the destinations of those exports? What do higher prices and renewed concerns about energy security mean for economic growth, geopolitical relationships, and climate policy? And of course, what does all this mean for oil prices and prices at the pump? We're lucky today to have a great panel to help us discuss this. Unfortunately, two of our speakers have given the news and the headlines, have already been called away, so we have a couple of substitutes for you. Toril Bosoni has been asked to attend the International Energy Agency Governing Board's meeting today. In her place, Christine Petrosian, a member of that vaunted BP alumni club, along with yours truly, will be leading us, and if you'll forgive me, to read a bit of her bio because we didn't have time to put it online. Christine started her career at Ernst & Young's corporate finance department, and then after earning a Master's of Science from Mineral Law and Policy in Scotland, from our good friend Professor Paul Stevens, I'm guessing, she joined BP, worked in both upstream gas trading and oil products trading, and has performed similar roles with Glencore before joining the International Energy Agency, where she now is a senior analyst covering refining and trade. Also joining us online will be Shikha Chaturvedi, Head of Global Gas Strategy at JP Morgan, as well. Natasha Kaneva was unfortunately called away. And then joining me here in person, our good friend and colleague Jim Crane, the Wallace Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute. So the running order today will be that Christine will present about 20 minutes of slides based on the International Energy Agency's monthly oil market outlook. Then we'll offer both Shikha and Jim opportunities for brief commentary, and then we'll move to the most important part, which is the conversation, including questions from our in-person audience, as well as our audience online can push questions to us as well. And we'll do all that, and we'll still wrap up by 10 o'clock Houston time. So without further ado, Christine, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this great introduction. Indeed, very interesting times ahead in the oil markets. I found myself that over the last several years, I've been telling that, this year was very interesting in oil market analysis, and yet it keeps getting more and more interesting. So I will start my presentation, and I will be sharing my slides, if that's okay with you. I think I corrected just one set of numbers. I believe you now have a full view of the slides, so that I can go ahead with the presentation, right?
We can see your slides. They're not in slideshow, Christine.
I am not in the slideshow. Let's see how to.
Try hitting F5.
Yeah, I am in the slideshow mode, right?
Huh. We can make it work, I think, Christine. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we, sorry, I think just before we had this, stop sharing, I will just try it again. Apologies. Slideshow. Okay, so let's go ahead. So if we were to have this presentation exactly 1 month ago, just at the eve of the invasion, what would be the main themes? Would be that, indeed, we see a continued demand recovery from the COVID disruption of enormous size that we also in 2020. That indeed this year the OPEC plus unwinding of cuts and the non-OPEC plus growth would bring on additional supplies so that the world oil balances would tip to the positive territory from a large oversized draw of about 2 million barrels a day last year. In general, we would be sort of in comfortable levels of headline oil balances, but still we'll be talking about certain pressure points and bottlenecks in the secondary oil balances, which is product markets. Now, of course, everything changed on the 24th of February with the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Since then, we have seen some responses from Western countries, mostly in terms of embargoes or voluntary abstention from oil companies, trading companies, from dealing with Russian origin crude oil products. This leading to basically Russian oil not being able to find homes, and eventually leading to supply shut-ins, what we forecast in our oil market report issued last week. We have also seen higher levels of prices leading to potential demand loss, higher levels of prices, and also a lower GDP forecast. Higher levels of prices, of course, could still encourage more oil production, and we will talk about that a bit later. And now, especially, we see a rather uncomfortable level in headline oil balances, in particular in the first half of this year, 2022. And we see a bit more drama, more action in the secondary oil market, which is oil products, refined oil products, first of all. Why all this? Yeah, indeed, as Mark already mentioned, Russia is just too big. It is literally too big in global oil markets, and it's basically everywhere. It's in the crude markets, it's in almost every significant product market, it's delivering oil almost everywhere globally, but of course it still does have its major markets. So if you look at the routes of Russian oil exports,
There you go. Okay, thank you.
it's mostly western route for seaborne crude oil through Baltic and Black Sea ports. There is a substantial amount of oil that goes to the west, to European countries by pipeline, by the Soviet era Druzhba pipeline. There is pipeline oil going to China, directly to China, or through Kazakhstan, through Kazakh pipelines. And there is Pacific seaborne trade from the Pacific ports going directly to China, Japan, and some other markets. And products account for almost 40% of Russian total oil exports. And this is also a big problem for global oil markets. In terms of main customers, EU, the European Union, is by far the largest. Together with some other non-EU countries, the whole European continent takes more than half of Russian crude oil exports. Of course, this is also for geographical reasons. This is simply the closest source to Europe. China is a large consumer. More than a fifth of Russian oil exports end up in China. US, OECD Asia, of course, US, Japan, Canada, and Australia have now banned imports from Russia, but it was really US and Japan and the UK importing some amounts of oil, with Australia not really, or Canada not really actually involved in much of oil trade with Russia, and some other smaller countries accounting for the remaining 11%. So really it's a big problem, but it's especially a big problem for Europe. When we set out to understand how much supply could be lost in Russia as a result of embargoes and voluntary self-sanctioning of oil companies that refuse to buy or deal with Russian oil, we sort of said, okay, what is the amount of oil that will not be shut in? This is, of course, oil that will be consumed domestically in Russia, oil that usually goes to the what Russians call near abroad countries, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and some bits and pieces to Azerbaijan as well. Then Druzhba oil, which feeds refineries in Central Europe, some of whom actually have no alternative sources of supply. We understood that, okay, probably this is going to persist for at least some time. And then Russian oil companies own several refineries in Europe with sort of operable capacity of around 600,000 barrels a day, not counting the Rosneft one, which sits on Druzhba pipeline. So we add up all this and we said, okay, this is the amount of crude that will not be shut in. And the potential loss was going to be around, between 2.5 and 3.5, 4 million barrels a day. So we ended up taking a round number of 3 million barrels a day. But of course, this is something that is very fluid, that can develop either way. Since the start of this month, when the inertia in the oil flows, in terms of contracts, in terms of sort of ramp down provisions in sanctions, is when after all the impacts of these additional factors were taken in, we now see that indeed right now the loadings and the destinations of Russian oil, crude oil and products, the impact is roughly 2.5 million barrels a day, month to month right now. We don't know yet how much of this oil that's loaded actually will find eventually a destination, because it's not very easy to reroute and redirect all oil flows. It has to do with vessels, with contractual, with insurance situation. So we are still in a process of evaluating, and we don't really know if this 3 million barrels a day number is going to hold comes April oil market report, or it's going to change either way. And of course, yesterday, in addition to the Russian shut-ins, as I was preparing the slide deck yesterday, there were the first news about the CPC terminal experiencing issues. And only this morning, European time, we find out a bit more detail that 2 out of the 3 loading facilities of the CPC terminal in the Black Sea are damaged. And essentially the Russian side is talking about a full cut in export volumes from this terminal for the next couple of months, possibly. CPC terminal loads Kazakh crude mostly. We understand that there is about 10% of Russian volumes from Russia that get mixed in the pipeline. And there is also Russian oil delivered by railroad to the terminal that is also exported from there. So again, we sort of woke up this morning and found another possibly 1 to 1.3 million barrels of oil gone in the global oil markets due to terminal situation of CPC. To be honest, we don't quite understand the severity of the terminal damage, because even though it's attributed to storm activity, we haven't seen any sort of major storm events in the sea. There's lots of talks about possible damage by the mines that have drifted from the Ukrainian sector of the Black Sea and eventually caused damage to these facilities. But I guess we will find out more details in the days to come. So with this reduction in this downgrade to Russian oil supply of about 3 million barrels a day, we now have revised down our oil supply projection for this year by about 2 million barrels a day. So previously we had global oil supply growing by 6 million barrels a day. Now we are only seeing 4.2 million barrels a day of growth. Saudi Arabia and its colleagues from the OPEC Plus agreement, other than Russia, of course, are going to deliver bulk of the gains. About 3.6 million barrels a day will come from that block. This is purely due to unwinding of the cuts. These figures do not include any additional supplies from these countries in an effort to balance global oil markets. US, nevertheless, is the second largest individual contributor to global oil supply growth. Year on year, the supplies are increasing almost by 1.4 million barrels a day. And the US alone accounts for about 65% of non-OPEC plus oil supply growth of 2.1 million barrels a day. So the gap that we will see eventually with shutdown, with assumed shut-ins of Russian crude oil is the largest in the first half of in the second quarter really of this year. There are, so the black line here is our current oil market balance, which includes also demand destruction impact that we will talk about shortly. Therefore, in order to fill this gap, especially in the second quarter of this year and partly in the third quarter, the world would need additional oil supplies. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the spare capacity held primarily by the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We are also looking at potential easing of sanctions on Venezuela and a potential deal with Iran that could bring on some additional barrels even when these deals are reached. There will be a time gap, a lead time required to bring these additional barrels to the market. What we understand is that Saudi and partially also UAE spare capacity is immediately available for the production, for the extra production. Of course, still oil is a physical commodity, and the immediate doesn't mean next day. We understand that it's going to be several weeks before the oil is produced and reaches the market, but nevertheless, these remain some of the first sources to fill the gap that we will see in the market. For the US, we have looked at some of the additional potential the US producers to bringing the oil to the market. Of course, US LTO, light tight oil production, has seen absolutely record levels of growth in the first years when it started, and then post 2016 and this sort of second wave of the shale revolution. It's all been very impressive and interesting. But what we see now is that the industry right now doesn't have some of the factors that were present before and that were contributing to and ensuring that rapid growth. Right now, it's a lack of spare capacity in human resources, in infrastructure, in drilled but uncompleted wells. The DAX reserves essentially were drawn last year to fuel the production growth. And we are sitting currently on sort of lower availability of these wells that can be brought online very quickly and contribute to increased production. The time lags have sort of increased as well. In fact, when we talk about lead times for US oil to come online, people usually have something like 3 to 6 months in their mind. When our analysts look at these, what they see is that, okay, there's 2 months of active work on the well required to bring it online, but in general, it takes up to 8 months with all the waits, with the times required to sit between the subsequent stages of operations on the well. So overall, we're talking about an 8-month lead for a well to come online. And as the industry is already operating on rather sort of on the margin, any additional effort is going to result in cost escalation that will require higher prices to be justified. Basically, this on the chart on the right that shows that additional, in orange, the additional potential of about 500,000 barrels a day of extra supply between now and 2022 would have to come at a cost of about 30% of escalation of drilling and other costs related to the supply. And also, since the early days of shale, or since even the middle part of shale history, there has been a lot more consolidation on the shale patch, and the share of more nimbler private companies has effectively gone down. Have larger corporations that are dealing with more and more of shale production, and the decision making here is, of course, less. It's slower and less reactive in a way. Moving on to demand, of course, demand is also going to contribute a bit to balancing of the market. We have cut our GDP forecast by almost 1 percentage point down to 3.4 percentage points. That's the global GDP. And also for this month, the oil prices that went into the demand model, they were higher by about 15% from February levels. So overall, this has resulted in about 1 million barrels a day of downgrade to our 2022 oil demand, which means that instead of growing by 3 million barrels a day, still recovering from the COVID slump, oil demand is going to increase by only 2 million barrels a day, 2.1 million barrels a day. In terms of products, this is a bit across the board. The usual suspects of gasoline, jet kerosene, gas oil, which has the largest market share in the world in terms of oil products, they are going to see some of the largest decreases. LPG demand is going to increase. Another good news for the US light tight oil and shale industry in general, because of the higher prices of naphtha, which is mostly derived from crude oil. We expect substitution of naphtha by LPG in the petrochemical crackers. So effectively, the only product that was revised higher is LPG. All the rest are going to see declines. In terms of regional revisions, of course, the first number one is actually Russia, because of the GDP impact, the impact on Russian GDP of all the sanctions that have already been announced. We expect that Russian GDP will actually contract by about 11% this year, year on year, and that's going to result in a large demand reduction. This demand fall in Russia is actually larger than what we saw during COVID, during the COVID pandemic. Back then, the demand was actually more resilient. But now, the situation is quite dramatic in some of the industry sectors in terms of earnings for people. So and some of this reduction is, of course, due to other exogenous factors like air traffic, which has been dramatically reduced. I think we're talking about more than 60% cut in air traffic. It's not only due to sanctions by Western European and other countries of refusing to allow access of Russian airplanes to their airspace, but also Russian airplanes being recalled effectively by the providers of aircraft. Most of them are leased from European and other companies, and effectively any appearance of these aircraft outside Russia in some of the regions may result in actual arrest of the aircraft. This is why Russians have also voluntarily cut their flights outside Russia and are only flying to a couple of destinations in older Soviet time aircraft that they cannot lose to legal action. The sort of the hidden aspect of the sanctions and self-sanctions on Russia is the impact on refining, because Russia indeed was one of the largest, if not the largest, exporter of refined products. So refined products do not include LPGs, ethane, and so on, because US in general is the largest exporter of oil products. But when it comes to refined products such as gasoline, fuel oil, diesel, jet kerosene, and naphtha, it's really Russia as a single individual country exporting about 2.8 million barrels a day of such products to global markets. So when you sanction Russian products, or when external buyers do not want to buy Russian products, they will have to find these products elsewhere. And the problem that we noticed before the invasion started, that materialized sometime last year, is the actual lack of spare capacity in refining. What happened is that since the start of COVID pandemic, about 3 million barrels of refining capacity has been shut globally, but mostly in the US, almost 1 million barrels a day, in Europe, 600,000 barrels a day, in Japan, in Singapore, and some other countries. And these refineries were not, long-term idle capacity. They were actually producing refineries that literally one day decided that they will shut, convert into renewable diesel processing or just terminal operations. And of course, conversion to renewable diesel operations is very asymmetric. You lose a few 100,000 barrels a day of petroleum refining capacity. You gain, a sixth of that in terms of diesel production. And some of these projects have not actually come online yet. It will take a couple of years before the operations start, renewable diesel operations start. So what we had already was a strong recovery of demand late last year, especially for diesel markets. Globally, we estimated that diesel demand reached a record level in the first quarter of 2022. Diesel cracks, and of course with jet demand recovering slightly more visibly from the air travel, with the air travel improving, suddenly the middle distillates started getting more and more expensive relative to crude, and it culminated in high diesel cracks already in the start of this year. On the other hand, we have extremely high natural gas prices, which are an important cost element particularly for diesel production, because diesel, almost from any level, any type of crude oil, when you produce diesel, you need to desulfurize it to bring sulfur content down to 10 ppm or even 200 ppm, because inherently diesel fractions keep more of the sulfur than, for example, naphtha fraction, which then later turns into gasoline. So natural gas costs, we estimate that contribute at least $5 to $10 a barrel to diesel prices nowadays. With all this, losing diesel exports, Russian diesel exports is going to be particularly difficult in the sense that it's hard to find excess spare capacity, even if you can find crude oil to refine, to produce these missing barrels of diesel, to find it in a place that can profitably turn it into diesel with all the associated costs of natural gas and so on. It's going to be really quite challenging. US is one of the largest diesel exporters globally, and when we're trying to find more diesel, literally, going through the list of every country and trying to optimize and maximize the refinery throughputs, well, because of the refinery shutdowns in the US, we would need to see US refinery utilization rates at very high rates, 95, 96% this summer, in order to see a slight increase in diesel output. Then, of course, not every refinery can run.
Could I just to keep us close to time, could I ask you to take about 2 more minutes?
Yes, and indeed, I have just 2 more slides, so it's going to be fine. So just to explain the situation with diesel, Europe is the biggest market for Russian diesel, but Russia is also the largest supplier of diesel to Europe. Europe gets more than half of its net diesel imports from Russia, and in general, there is the issue of geographical convenience historically, that the diesel trade is shaped between 2 close neighbors. That's why you have large flows of US to Latin America, Russia to Europe, and Asia and Middle East to Africa. So refineries in each of these origin regions, they basically kitted their refineries to their assets to produce the specifications required in these markets. And Europe being one of the most stringent diesel specification regions, it's going to be slightly more difficult to find supplies elsewhere. And so we saw the impact on diesel cracks in Europe, early days after the invasion, one particular day of the closing of the ice castle contract, they reached a historical high of $74 a barrel, even larger than in 2008. The time of real physical diesel crunch. This has come down to just $40 a barrel, but still we're talking about the sustained, if these cracks are sustained at around 40, 50 that we're seeing right now as we speak, it's going to be a historical record. We talked about spare capacity in terms of crude oil production, possible spare capacity in refining, but in terms of OECD stocks that for the last 40 years have sort of provided some sort of cushion and have been utilized in coordinated releases only 4 times. So this was the 4th time that we announced a stocks release a couple of weeks ago. Now, in terms of industry stocks, not the government stocks, these OECD total oil industry stocks are about 335 million barrels a day, million barrels lower than a 5-year average. So they are in a relatively tight position compared to still robust levels of demand. So I will leave you with this, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. Shika.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me from the JP Morgan side. And I think Christine did a great job just framing up what's going on right now in the oil markets. But, we clearly are seeing the ostracized sort of Russian crude cargoes at this point in time. And I think what we need to think about is the numbers and what particularly Europe is going to try to do by Thursday. I think they're going to make a decision Thursday, and it just doesn't feel like there's a political will right now to ban Russian imports of crude at this point in time. What we've done is we've taken into account the idea that this sort of self-sanctioning, right? This is the new patriotic kind of term in the oil markets at this point in time, but the self-sanctioning is around 3 million barrels a day as of today, and we've embedded it kind of decreasing to 2 million barrels a day in April, and then in perpetuity, we think that there is a loss of Russian supply by probably about 1 million barrels a day that we're holding in there, where people or consumers can find other sources for their oil imports. And so what that really has done, right, is that's what's embedded into our price forecast, is this idea of this less sort of quote unquote exports that are out there from Russia at this point in time. And it's kind of what it's driving our price forecast for the second quarter, where we do think we can reach the highs of 120 to 130. And I'm just looking right now at the screen and we're already at 120. So, we could still go higher from here. And I think Christine laid out very clearly that there is a problem right now from a products perspective for Europe, right? So we're hearing from trade shops right now that diesel in 2 to 3 weeks is going to run out if Europe doesn't start taking in more barrels, Russian barrels at this point in time. And that's right before the driving season. So that is very detrimental to the economy. And I know that those are the things that are being probably weighed on as we speak in their meetings and whatever is happening this week with on the political front. So obviously Christine mentioned the outage at CPC. We haven't modeled that in yet, but it is still substantial. I think it is probably, it's got the market nervous at this point in time because it's immediately 1 to 1.5 million barrels that could just be offline for the next 1 to 2 months. And so we haven't factored that in yet, but certainly that does provide upside risk to our price forecast. What I will say though, is that we're also dealing with a competitive, risk factor on the demand side, where we are starting to see some impacts from COVID, the resurgence that's happening in China. We think it's about close to 1 million barrels a day of demand impacts in the second quarter. And as it starts to spread through the UK and finally make it towards the US, we think it's somewhere between 500 and 550 KBD of a demand impact in the third and fourth quarter. So we definitely need to be monitoring that and what that, how we don't think it should be substantial in longevity because it's a less of a strain, but we certainly are starting to see flight data, obviously in China, has gone down significantly. Mobility data across all 3 regions, the US, Europe, and Asia, is showing lower at this point in time. And so I do think those 2 competing factors is kind of what's holding pricing more in place and more in check than you're seeing obviously in the European gas market, which there aren't very many options that are out there. The one thing I will say, and I think that this is important, if tomorrow or if there is a decision, which we think is very unlikely, but if there's a decision to remove the 3.7 million barrels a day that are flowing into Europe completely, at this point in time. So that would be an extra 700 KBD from where we see today. And that's for in longevity. We see oil prices potentially moving up to $185 a barrel. And that to us is very detrimental from an economics perspective, for it's recessionary at that point. And I think what's another important point is the connectivity between the oil market and the gas market, in the sense, if you have $185 a barrel of crude, you are probably at where current TTF price is right now, you're switching all of your gas, your oil demand that had switched from gas to oil back to gas. And the gas market can't afford that. So to me, it means that, the TTF market will also move up. The global LNG market will also move up. So it is not a very great scenario from an energy price perspective for consumers if in fact we were to see a sort of all out ban, which we do think is a low likelihood. So I'll stop there right now because I know we are low on time, and pass it along.
Shika, thank you very much. And Jim Crane.
Well, hi everybody. It's good to be back. Good to see you all. So I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that are keeping some Middle Eastern barrels or big Middle Eastern producers, including some friends of the U.S., erstwhile friends maybe, from bringing their spare capacity online. So talk a little bit about some of the political disputes that are sort of in the background, if you will, and maybe not in the background so much anymore. They're starting to actually spill into the open. So about four to five points that I'll make. So it's kind of a strange situation here to see the U.S. in open dispute with a couple of its oil-producing friends in the Middle East, so the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Right now, this is there were some pre-existing fault lines that were kind of under the surface that have kind of blown out into the open now. Pretty unfamiliar situation with the U.S. and its friends in the Middle East. Number of issues causing the friction. First of all, I'm sure you've heard, is that the U.S. is being seen as kind of an unreliable partner in the region. That this Carter Doctrine of 1980, where where we've agreed to use military force to protect our interests in the region. There's a worry in the region, based on some evidence and some signs that we're less willing to and less committed to that doctrine. Now we still, of course, maintain tens of thousands of troops and lots of military bases in the region. We're operating missile defenses, in some cases successfully in the region, but that feeling persists. The second point is that U.S. Middle Eastern relations are starting to get politicized a bit, and this is not a good thing, right? So this is a product of schisms in the region among the GCC, the six Gulf monarchies, themselves, and polarization here in the U.S. So we've got, Democrats, the Democratic Party here in the U.S. seems to be willing to deal, or more willing to deal with Iran, despite some opposition from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, right? Republicans are more supportive of the activist foreign policies that have cropped up in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, at least temporarily so, including the Yemen war. And there's been some overt favoritism towards Trump in those three governments. Trump stood by Mohammed bin Salman after the Saudi government murder of the Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey. However, a big caveat to that, Trump also did not respond to the Abqaiq attacks, right? In 2019, the big attack on the Abqaiq and Khurais facilities that took about almost 6 million barrels a day of oil off the market. So, the Biden administration came in. Qatar and Oman were both overtly pleased with this, and the UAE, Israel, and Saudi Arabia were not. Biden had described Saudi as a pariah during the campaign, retracted the Trump terror designation on the Houthi in Yemen, and it's been kind of dragging his feet a little bit on resupplying Patriot interceptors to the Patriot missile batteries that are operated by the U.S., actually. A third thing is that our friends in the Middle East have been unwilling to get dragged into some of our disputes, some U.S. disputes with China and Russia. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia are actually kind of outwardly favoring Russia a little bit, at least, in what in their behavior thus far, right? You probably saw the story in the Wall Street Journal where leaders of both countries refused to take calls from Biden to bring more oil to market, and then went on the phone directly after that with President Putin. So some pretty overt favoritism, unlikely to be forgotten, I think, in Washington. U.S. Patriot missile batteries did take out some incoming Houthi missiles, but even after that, Mohammed bin Zayed, incoming into the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed still refused to meet with the Central Command, CENTCOM Commander General. UAE abstained from the UN Security Council condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well. There's some bringing back of Syria and Bashar al-Assad into the fold in the region. UAE is one of the countries doing that. Assad had a state visit to Abu Dhabi and Dubai recently. Most of the other countries have kept their distance, but State Department issued a pretty strong protest about that. Fourth of these factors is the OPEC Plus angle, and this has kind of been a big complication. Russian membership now, effectively in OPEC, has reduced U.S. influence with these producers. They now need to take Russian concerns into mind when they make oil market decisions. Pretty big, momentous, change in oil marketing strategy with these two former strategic competitors, Saudi Arabia and Russia, right, at each other's throats during the Cold War. Now engages strategic cooperation. Big change. Saudi is being cautious at a minimum, doesn't want to be seen as stealing market share from Russia, and wants to keep that, what's been pretty successful cooperation going. And if it doesn't hurt to, if you don't like President Biden and some of his policies, to punish him by withholding some oil. I guess the last of these is the security ties. Is a desire to broaden security ties we're hearing about in the region. Now this, broaden them to Russia and China besides just having the U.S. as the sole hard security guarantor. These kind of feelings have been going on for a while. I was writing about this, more than a decade and a half ago in the region. That's been on a long time concern. We used to always say in the region, when the sheikhs dial 911, the phone doesn't ring in, Moscow or Beijing, whatever, it rings in Washington. At some point, right, that if we keep going down this road, it may start ringing in more than one place. And then do I have another minute or two to talk about the Houthi strikes, or should I leave it there?
I'll give you one, but not two.
Okay, all right. So just lots of very successful Houthi strikes, surprisingly successful. I was looking at some data on how many of these airstrikes are actually getting through. Most of the missiles are being intercepted, but the drones are getting through. More than half of the drone strikes have been successful. So it's been pretty surprising, I think, and that's probably the root of a lot of the frustration that we haven't heard about the sheer number, hundreds of these strikes. Of course, there's a war going on in Yemen, right? And the Saudis and the Emiratis are prosecuting that war, right? We have to remember, but the Houthis are getting more and more adept at attacking sites, mostly oil installation sites on the ground, and that's behind a lot of that frustration as well.
All right. Thanks, Jim. So we're now going to move to some questions. For folks who are online, you can use the chat function, and we can have a look there. We'll also ask people here in person to just raise your hands if you have questions. Let me start, though, with one for Christine. When I have to say, when Shika mentioned $185 a barrel as an upside price of oil, you could feel everyone in the room sit up. And I know, Christine, that the IEA just last week published a 10-point plan of how countries and consumers could quickly reduce oil demand, if the need arose. And I was wondering if you could just give a couple of highlights from some of those concepts of, what are the types of things that could be done in a hurry to reduce oil demand?
Indeed, Mark, the headline for our report was saving oil in a hurry. So most of these, for years, for decades, we've been talking about energy efficiency, about more efficient vehicle fleets, about substituting oil by other means, about electrification of transport, about biofuels, and so on. But of course, a lot of these have lead times that are beyond several months. In terms of very quick approaches, most of these are really at the end consumer level, either behavioral, either mandated or sort of, advertised, encouraged behavioral changes. In our 10-point plan, the largest impact that we have singled out is basically car sharing and other practices to reduce fuel use. Car sharing is mostly for places and countries where a single sort of person car ride is dominant. So we're talking about the US to increase carpooling and so on. In Europe, it seems to be less of an issue. That's sort of the single largest element, contributing about 470,000 barrels a day of this 2.7 plan. Then we have things like making the use of public transport cheaper and incentivizing other forms of mobility, such as walking and cycling. Again, this is probably more doable for European countries with the necessary urban infrastructure in terms of walkable streets and so on. The things that are, both can be mandated and also encouraged, advertised. Also, some of the more on the mandated side is the efficient driving habits for freight trucks and delivery of goods, optimization of the use of such fleet. It's reducing speed limits on highways. We have seen this used in the past in European countries for sure, in the previous rounds of very high oil prices. For example, this could save as much as 300,000 barrels a day of oil from just personal vehicles and another 140,000 from trucks. We're talking about levels for what we call advanced economies, which is basically another term to say OECD countries. But again, these habits are copied by non-OECD countries, by the developing world. Of course, the impact could be higher. So things like replacing long-distance car journeys with high-speed and night trains. This is slightly smaller impact, given that in fact the air travel, as we speak, is not yet back to pre-COVID levels. So the impact from that is not going to be huge, and the air travel itself is actually on the recovery path.
Okay.
But basically, behavioral changes.
Good. Thank you. Shika, was there anything you wanted to add from JP Morgan's perspective on, how to quickly reduce oil demand before we move on?
Yeah, I just think, and I think those are all great ideas, and I think that's the right way. But until we have some sort of government push for this, right? It makes it very difficult. One of the things that caught us off guard with the EU Commission's kind of Repower EU plan was that one of the first things they wanted to do was mitigate price impacts on consumers. And to me, demand destruction, you need to feel price impacts to really do that. I think back to when my father was just turning off the lights everywhere that I went, as a child, just to save on electricity. You need to feel that before you really start to see that. And the speed limit thing I think is great. If I recall, I think it was "Don't be fuelish" was sort of the tagline in the U.S. So those things need to happen, but it's very difficult if you don't have this impact starting to hit your consumers more significantly. And obviously in the oil space, it is doing that from a gasoline price perspective. And I do think that's why mobility is down right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Question from the audience. Could I ask you, sir, just keep it succinct?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Could you just comment on how the things like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve could be used to bridge us to a period of higher supply?
Mm-hmm. So the United States currently holds about 580 million barrels of oil in its strategic stockpile. The Energy Department claims that it can be reduced at a maximum rate, released at a maximum rate of just over 4 million barrels a day, but that could only be sustained for 90 days. Christine, would you like to comment on the broader IEA strategic stock program? I mean, how big they are and how much could be released for how long?
So for the moment, to be honest, I don't think there is a number that says across the IEA, this is the maximum drawdown rate of the stocks. It has never really been tested. And in fact, this latest announcement was our largest release. And some of this release was not an actual physical draws from strategic reserves. Part of this came from reducing the stockholding obligation for companies, for corporations. So they could hold less stocks, mandated by EU and IEA regulations, and make more products and oil available to the markets. When in terms of crude oil, we, depending on the size of disruption and the scale and the duration, I think we are probably at the most comfortable level when it comes to the oil space. For products, Europe, which is the largest importer of diesel in the world, and middle distillates in general, theoretically, we have enough stocks to cover 2 years of imports, 1.5 years of imports from Russia. But when disruptions happen, they don't, it's not just one single source that you're cutting. The reverberations, they go through many channels. So I think in realistic terms, to say more than several months is probably It's probably an overestimation. Plus, the markets, when they see the rates of drawdown, the backwardations, the price action is going to go even,
Right.
to levels never seen before. So.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yes, and I think it's a good point that the strategic stocks were not designed to be a going concern. They were, kind of stopgap emergency measures. So unfortunately, we are running out of time, and to honor your time and those of our speakers, I wanted to make sure we wrap up. So let me try and do that. Many of you know that before, early in my career, I was actually an analyst and a manager at the US CIA. I'm going to get all choked up just talking about it. Early on in my management career, there was a terrorist attack in one of the countries that I covered. And I found an analyst very upset at her desk saying, "How can I do my job? How can you ask me not to care?" And the answer is, of course you care. But the way you do your job in a stressful situation like that is to focus on the facts and the cold-blooded analysis. And the way you add value and to serve policymakers is to keep the emotions out of it and to focus on the analysis. We've had the good fortune today to have 3 great speakers to help us wade through all of the heat and help us to think about what's really going on. And we've heard some really, I think, profound points about how tight the oil market is, how much of a risk there is, to future supplies coming out of this, not just of crude oil, but of crude oil and refined products as a complex, and the complications that arise from disrupting one or the other and how the whole system is connected and has to reallocate. And ditto for the fact that, oh, by the way, it's not just about oil, natural gas comes into play. Other forms of energy come into play as well. And as if that wasn't enough, we have to remember that the COVID bug is still out there and mutating away, and seeing that as a way to think about it. We've talked about what are the options here, the safety valves, and we talked about spare capacity and whether it will be used or not. And how geopolitical concerns color into that. Watch the OPEC Plus meeting on March 31st. We talked about strategic stockpiles and other government programs. At the end of the day, it's a reminder again that oil is existential to our way of life today. It may not be in the future if we pursue climate strategies successfully, but the reality of the world today is that this matters a lot. Now, will it accelerate climate policy down the road? Will it accelerate efforts to develop more fossil fuel supplies? Will it do both? Wait and see. Fortunately for you all, we at the Baker Institute are going to be covering these issues very closely. Hopefully, you will join us for future conversations as we see how this all plays out. In the meanwhile, please join me in thanking our speakers for a great conversation today.
Yeah.